In the northern plains, when spring arrives, vast stretches of wild grasses begin to sprout. Having curled up through the winter in the snow, they break through the earth when the time is right and grow vigorously. Among these wild grasses are edible wild vegetables, eaten by people as well as by cattle and sheep. Some of these wild vegetables are bitter, some even more bitter, some are astringent, and some are toxic. They grow in a chaotic tangle, like people, with both good and bad. When she was a child, Grandma used to say she was like a wild vegetable. Shallow roots, bitter hearts, easy to grow, and inconspicuous, spread out on the ground, picked and eaten by anyone. During the Qingming festival, the country had a 3-day holiday and Ling Shan's family of 3 was planning where to go. Her son, Fong Can, who was in middle school, wanted to go to a popular tourist spot, while Fong Jing wanted to climb the Great Wall. The two argued so much that their faces turned red. Ling Shan, wearing an apron and holding a bowl of mushroom soup, walked out of the kitchen with a smile. Everyone is on vacation, so wherever we go, it'll be crowded. I've got a great place in mind. The father and son looked at her. Qingming is for paying respects and March is for outings. Why don't we go to Hanzhuang town? We can combine the worship and outing in one trip, Ling Shan said in a gentle tone that made it hard to argue with her. Is there anything fun there? Her son asked. Being close to nature, Ling Shan handed her son a bowl of soup. Is there anything good to eat? Her husband asked. How about wild vegetables? She handed him a bowl of soup as well. The two of them exchanged a look. One grimaced, and the other stuck out his tongue. After dinner, her son returned to his room to read. Fong Jing went to take a shower, and Ling Shan was hanging clothes on the balcony of their bedroom. The family's clothes were mostly in plain colors, especially Ling Shan's. She was a gentle person and didn't like bright red or purple. Her husband's shirt had a soft pink ring around the collar, while she had a small stain on her sweater dress. She frowned. It seemed she had bought a fake laundry detergent. Fong Jing stealthily walked over and suddenly hugged her from behind. Ugh, how come you walk so quietly? She lightly hit him with her fist, playfully complaining. What are you thinking about? He whispered in her ear. Ling Shan looked at Fong Jing, her words caught in her throat. Finally, she shook her head. You mentioned Hanzhuang town. That's your hometown, right? Why the sudden interest in going there? It's nothing. Just thought of it suddenly. Ling Shan continued hanging the clothes, and the streetlights in the distance illuminated the straight road. She thought of her hometown, that small and remote village, and the long gravel road that seemed endless. If you don't tell me, I won't go tomorrow, Fong Jing said, pretending to be regretful. You're teasing me. Ling Shan pinched him. Actually, it's nothing. I've just been dreaming about my mom these days, and it makes me uneasy. She lowered her head, probably because it's almost Qingming. It's been so many years since you've been back. Do you still remember the way? Of course I do. Ling Shan smiled gently and whispered something in Fong Jing's ear. The breath from her lips made the soft hairs in his ears tingle. Fong Jing's face turned red. With a mischievous smile, he threw Ling Shan onto the bed. All right, we'll leave tomorrow morning. But tonight, we need to practice first. The next morning, Fong Jing must have promised something to their son, because Fong Can agreed to join them on the trip. The family of 3 drove off. The weather was beautiful, and the wind was gentle. They chatted and laughed along the way, except for the occasional ping from their phones, which briefly interrupted their harmony. Fong Can teased his dad, saying his boss was like Zhou Bapai, never letting anyone rest on weekends. Fong Jing sighed dramatically. Yeah, otherwise I wouldn't work, but then no one would get those cola chicken wings and oil-braised shrimp at the dinner table. He then glanced at the wild vegetables growing along the roadside. Looks like we'll have to eat wild vegetables. What's wrong with wild vegetables? They're very nutritious. The rebellious teenager wasn't about to admit his dad was right. All right, then I'll make you wild vegetables to eat. I'm great at it. Ling Shan joined in the fun. Mom, am I being sent a free gift with phone recharge? The 3 of them laughed together. The road to Hanzhuang town wasn't far or near, a smooth highway that suddenly turned into a rough road after a sharp bend. The road was filled with small stones and large gravel. The car bumped up and down, occasionally interrupted by chickens and sheep strolling out of the bushes, lazily walking as if hoping to be hit by a car and get some big compensation. Perhaps it was the near arrival that made Ling Shan's heart race more with every passing mile. She looked at the silent little village, which looked just as she remembered, dilapidated, old, and poor. The house in the northeast corner of the village was the one where she grew up. When the car stopped, a cloud of dust rose, and Ling Shan's childhood memories merged with the sight of the house before her. The house was already in ruins, the windows and doors like dark, gaping mouths. The yard was overgrown with wild grass, especially in the middle, where it grew thick and grayish-green. Her memories were just as broken and worn as the house in front of her. In her fragmented childhood memories, her father was a man who wasted his days drinking, gambling, and womanizing. When drunk, he would beat his wife and daughter. Her mother, unable to bear the abuse, fled the village. Grandma, who could barely afford to feed them, raised Ling Shan, venting all her resentment toward Ling Shan's mother onto her. Among the children her age, she was the smallest, ate the worst, and wore the shabbiest clothes. In the eyes of the villagers, she was a simple, silly child. When bullied, she wouldn't speak up, and when beaten, she wouldn't cry. When she was 9, her mother suddenly returned, just as abruptly as she had left. Her mother cried as she held Ling Shan, but Ling Shan, holding a tattered doll, calmly watched her. She didn't understand what role her mother played. Her mother's return was like a lamb entering the lion's den. She was greeted by the years of accumulated abuse from her father. Ling Shan watched the woman, bloodied from the beating, but she only felt annoyed and irritated. She just wanted to go back to her room and sleep. The next day, Grandma told her that her mother had run away again. Ling Shan, still fiddling with her broken doll, thought that being abandoned once or twice didn't make much of a difference. She stared at the long gravel road leading out of the village, wondering how long her mother would have to walk to escape. A day? A year? Or a lifetime? The night her mother ran away, her father suddenly fell ill, foaming at the mouth, his face turning purple. He didn't even make it to the hospital before he died. Grandma sat in the yard wailing, saying that the poison bottle had a handprint on it, and that it was the woman's return that killed her son. Ling Shan didn't believe her grandmother's words. She had seen the neighbor's aunt drink pesticide. After half a bottle, she was still alive and kicking. She was taken to the hospital and lived for a week before dying, and her face wasn't as purple as her father's. Ling Shan thought her father loved drinking, had a violent temper, and must have drunk himself to death or died from the anger. She didn't understand why Grandma cried so much. For someone like that, what was the point of crying when they died? A year after her father passed away, Grandma, filled with grief for her son, followed him in death. Next to the new grave, another one appeared, surrounded by a circle of gray, lush wild vegetables. Having lost both her father and her grandmother, Ling Shan became the village's scapegoat. She was bullied and stared at with disdain. Children would throw stones at her, and men would look at her with ill intentions. Later, a distant relative took her away. The simple, silly girl left the village, never to return for 20 years. Now, standing in the yard where she grew up, Ling Shan felt a mix of emotions. This place is falling apart. Fong Can's voice snapped Ling Shan back to reality. He pushed open a half-destroyed door. The room was dimly lit, and a pungent, musty smell immediately hit them. The ceiling had holes of all sizes, casting light and shadows on the floor. Kids don't understand. This is called retro style. Fong Jing joked, setting up a tent in the yard. Their purpose here, aside from the Qingming festival and the outing, was to camp and have a picnic. Fong Jing was someone who loved adventure. He enjoyed all things wild. Noon, the three of them quickly had some fast food. Fong Jing grabbed the ceremonial paper money and prepared to go pay his respects, But Ling Shan shook her head. She could no longer remember where her family was buried. Let's just burn it in the yard. She found an old broken ceramic pot in the house and set a fire in a sheltered spot. The paper money and ingots turned to ash in the world of the living, and in the world of the dead, they transformed into currency and heavy gold and silver. In the nearby mountains and fields, a few people were digging wild vegetables. This reminded Ling Shan of her old habit. She had been quite good at digging wild vegetables when she was younger. Back then, wild vegetables were a way to fill her stomach when food was scarce. Now, after years of eating refined grains, wild vegetables had become a rare delicacy. Ling Shan pulled her son along to join the group digging wild vegetables. With excitement, she explained the different types of wild vegetables and their flavors to Fong Can, carefully warning him about the toxic ones. In the evening, the wild vegetables they dug up were split in half. One part was made into a cold dish, the other half into soup. Ling Shan ate them as a way of reliving old memories, while Fong Jing ate them for their fresh taste. Fong Can, on the other hand, sat off to the side, nibbling on bread. The taste of the wild vegetables reminded him of the grasslands and the sheep and cattle there. He was different from his father. He didn't like trying new things and wasn't interested in chasing excitement. Fong Jing, however, loved excitement. As the night deepened, and their son was sound asleep, his hands wandered over Ling Shan's body. The night was filled with the soft embrace of moonlight, and they slept under the stars, only to be woken by the wind and morning light the next day. The next morning, after their passionate night, Fong Jing jumped up full of energy, ready for the day. He wandered around the area and eventually found a patch of flowers behind the house. He called his wife and son to come take photos. Ling Shan wasn't fond of taking photos, so she played the role of photographer, snapping away, not realizing how many pictures she had taken until her phone battery ran out. At lunch, Fong Jing continued to talk about the wild vegetables they had eaten the night before. Ling Shan smiled knowingly, already having guessed what he wanted. She cracked a few eggs into the pan and threw in a handful of fresh wild vegetables. When the dish was finished, the bright yellow and vibrant green made it irresistible. Fong Can, drawn in by the aroma, stared at the pan of food meant for cows and sheep. Some of these are bitter. Do you really want to eat them? Ling Shan asked with a smile. It's said that like father, like son, yet the two of them were so different. Ling Shan watched her son hesitate. With a swift move, she pulled out a big bag of snacks from the car. It's just wild vegetables. If you don't want to eat it, that's fine. It's not something great anyway. Soon, the plate of wild vegetable scrambled eggs was devoured by the couple, with Fong Jing eating as if he couldn't get enough, almost swallowing his tongue. These are so delicious. Let's dig up more wild vegetables later and take some home. Fong Jing's eyes sparkled with excitement. Okay, Ling Shan smiled softly, wiping the oil off the corner of his mouth. In the afternoon, after digging up a large bag of wild vegetables, Fong Jing reluctantly got ready to head back. The gravel road was rough, the car was hot and stuffy, and when they opened the windows, the scent of animal manure wafted in. Fong Jing gagged, feeling something rise in his throat, and soon, his stomach began to churn as well. Ahead of them appeared a flock of sheep. Fong Jing honked the horn, but the shepherd lazily flicked his whip and showed no sign of moving out of the way. At this point, Fong Jing's stomach was in turmoil, and after a sour liquid surged up his throat, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He stopped the car and hunched over on the side of the road, gagging. Fong Jing's stomach hurt so much it felt like it was being twisted with a knife. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Ling Shan hurried out of the car, startled by Fong Jing's pale face. She turned and saw her own face in the rearview mirror. It too was drained of color. It was then that she felt a sharp pain in her own stomach. What was going on? Could they have been poisoned? What about their son? He wouldn't be affected, would he? Just as she was about to check on Fong Can, a wave of sour and spicy nausea rose in her throat. She bent down and vomited violently, expelling bile, as if her internal organs were about to come out through her mouth. Her ears rang for what felt like an eternity before she finally heard Fong Can calling her. Seeing his normal complexion, she let out a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, Fong Jing was writhing on the ground, clutching his stomach. "Hurry, call an ambulance." The violent vomiting drained Ling Shan of her strength, leaving her feeling limp like a noodle. Fong Can rummaged through Ling Shan's bag for her phone, but it was turned off. He then grabbed Fong Jing's phone. Just then, a message popped up on the screen. He frowned in disgust. The ambulance arrived with its sirens flashing, taking the unconscious couple and the terrified Fong Can with it. Fong Jing's poisoning was severe, and he was rushed to the ICU. Ling Shan had eaten less and vomited most of it out, so after a stomach wash, she was transferred to a regular ward. The doctors were no strangers to such cases. Every season, there were always people who got poisoned by eating wild vegetables. Some recovered after a few days, like Ling Shan, while others lost their lives. As for whether Fong Jing would survive, the doctors weren't sure. "Depends on his constitution. Your husband is still young. He'll pull through," the doctor tried to offer reassurance. Fong Jing's mother, who had rushed from their hometown, kept accusing her daughter-in-law. From the moment of their marriage, she never liked Ling Shan. She believed Ling Shan had caused her son's death. Fong Jing lay quietly in the hospital bed while his mother-in-law was making a scene in the hallway. "Why not you? Why not you?" she repeatedly shouted, and Ling Shan couldn't answer. If it were possible to switch places, she would have gladly lain in that hospital bed instead. Inside, she felt both regret and resentment. She regretted going to that broken village and hated herself for eating those wild vegetables. She had been so good at gathering wild vegetables when she was a child. How could she not tell the difference between the toxic and the safe ones now? A few days later, Ling Shan was discharged from the hospital, and Fong Can went back to school as usual. Meanwhile, Fong Jing still lay motionless in the hospital, with only the beeping of the machines confirming that he was still alive. At night, Ling Shan went to collect the clothes from the balcony. Her husband's shirt collar, which had once been a pale pink, was nearly invisible, while the stain on her sweater had become even more noticeable after drying. Fong Jing's phone lit up and buzzed incessantly, disturbing the quiet room. Annoyed, Ling Shan turned it off. Fong Jing was barely alive. Couldn't they stop bothering him? Ling Shan lay awake that night, turning the photos they had taken in the flower field. She saw herself, looking awkward but smiling with her family, seemingly happy and full of warmth. Ling Shan looked at the photos, reflecting on the first picture of her childhood. In Ling Shan's memory, she had almost no photos of herself, none for her 100-day celebration, none for her first birthday. The first time she saw a picture of herself was when she was 9 years old. That year, with patched-up clothes and 2 streams of snot running from her nose, she was led by her teacher to the school gate, where the teacher pointed to a woman with long, dark braided hair and said, "This is your mother." The woman was dressed neatly, her eyes red and filled with tears. "Shan Shan, I'm your mother. Come here." The woman waved to her. "Mother?" Ling Shan looked at the woman in confusion. She had no memories of her mother since she was 3 or 4 years old. Grandma said that her mother had abandoned her and run off with someone else. She didn't remember her mother's face, but she remembered her mother's long, black braid trailing behind her. In the spring, her mother would pick a bunch of wildflowers and weave them into Ling Shan's hair. "Look, my daughter is a little fairy." "Mom," Ling Shan whispered softly. "Hey." The woman hugged her tightly, tears streaming into Ling Shan's hair. Ling Shan's snot also rubbed off onto the woman's shirt. "Look, this is you when you were little." The woman held her tightly and pulled out a black and white photo from her clothes. In the picture, a tiny child with a small face was shaking a rattle, showing 2 new teeth. The photo had lost its gloss, its edges frayed, likely from being handled repeatedly, stroked over and over. "Come with me, okay?" The woman looked at her with red eyes. Ling Shan nodded innocently, not understanding where the woman meant by go. The woman led her from the north of the village to the west. Ling Shan almost had to jog to keep up. She knew that once they left the gravel road, they would be out of Hanzhuang town. Ling Shan didn't know when her father had caught up with them. He suddenly sprang out like a black dog, barking and running. Within moments, he knocked the woman to the ground and threw Ling Shan aside, like tossing a broken doll. "Dare to steal my daughter? I'll kill you." Running away and still coming back? Grandma glared at the woman on the ground, gripping Ling Shan's arm tightly. The villagers gathered around, excitedly watching, amused by the rare spectacle of a man dragging a woman by her hair through the streets, something that rarely happened in their monotonous lives. The village had stepped forward to stop the scene. Family matters should be dealt with at home, not in public. Don't disgrace us in the streets. The villagers jeered, calling the village head nosy. Amidst the commotion, the woman broke free and ran again, just as sneaky as when she had come. That night, her father was furious about the woman's escape. Drunk out of his mind, he smashed all the broken plates and bowls in the house, not leaving a single one intact. If that woman hadn't run away, those plates would have been replaced by her body on the floor. After venting his anger, her father fell into a deep sleep in the outer room, the insects at the corner of the wall buzzing incessantly. Ling Shan, holding her broken doll, stared at the stars outside. The pale moonlight illuminated Grandma's face beside her, so white it looked like she wasn't alive. At that moment, a figure appeared outside the window, moving quietly, like an old mouse spirit that had trained itself to walk like a human. "Shan, are you asleep?" The mouse spirit spoke, and it was the same woman from the daytime. Ling Shan sat up, looking at the woman's long braid from the window. Come with your mother, okay?" the woman said softly, the moonlight shining down on her head, making her look like a fairy. "Come on." The woman waved her hand at her. At that moment, Ling Shan suddenly burst into loud, sharp tears, her cries cutting through the night like a cat in a graveyard. Tears streamed into her mouth, salty and bitter, like the wild vegetable soup she had drunk earlier that evening. She cried because she saw a shadow appear behind the woman. Even though the shadow was obscured by the moonlight, she could clearly see the grimace on the face within. It was her father. The woman let out a sharp scream, and her father quickly dragged her into the house. It was only when they were inside that Ling Shan saw that her father wasn't holding the woman's braid, but a rope. A sturdy, rough hemp rope, strangling the woman's delicate neck. Ling Shan watched as the woman's face turned from white to red, then from red to purple. She mumbled Ling Shan's name weakly. Shan. Ling Shan stopped crying and looked at the woman on the floor, no longer struggling. She didn't feel fear, as though the woman lying there was someone unrelated to her. Grandma was beside her, gripping her arm tightly, her face cold as stone. The moonlight was bright and clear, and Ling Shan leaned against the window, watching her father dig into the earth in the yard. The faint scratching sounds were magnified by the night, as the wild vegetables were pulled from the soil, shriveled and curled in a corner. Soon, a fresh layer of earth covered them, getting thicker and thicker until they were no longer visible. The moonlight was cool, and the wind blew gently. The soil in the yard was smooth and even. The next morning, Grandma told her that the woman had run away again. That night, her father suddenly turned pale, his body convulsing. Grandma cried out for help and ran toward the neighbors, but she tripped in the middle of the yard where there had once been a patch of thick wild grass. Ling Shan, holding her broken doll, calmly watched her father foaming at the mouth. She remembered the neighbor's chicken, which had struggled to survive after drinking pesticide. Later, the neighbor said her father had died before reaching the hospital, his eyes wide open, unable to close even in death. Ling Shan wondered, how big were his eyes? Were they as wide as the woman's eyes had been last night? Her father died, and Ling Shan became more and more dazed, while Grandma went crazy. It felt like everyone in that house was cursed. The foolish, crazy grandmother and granddaughter depended on each other. When spring arrived, Grandma's illness worsened. She babbled incoherently about the woman returning to kill her. Ling Shan didn't believe Grandma's words. How could such a gentle, weak woman kill anyone? The moonlight was cool, and Ling Shan turned over in bed, no longer willing to recall the past. For the past few days, Ling Shan had been running back and forth between home and the hospital. She couldn't eat or sleep, her body withering like a wild vegetable scorched by the sun. Fortunately, her husband's condition had finally improved. The doctor said Fong Jing's vital signs were getting better and his will to live was strong, so the chances of him waking up were high. Upon hearing this, Ling Shan hugged her son, tears streaming down her face. With the hope that Fong Jing could wake up, the days now held something to look forward to. She went to the water room to fetch water and wash him, looking at her tired reflection in the mirror and managing a weary smile. As she left the water room, she passed a woman in a red dress. The strong scent of perfume made her cough, and the sweet, cloying fragrance lingered even in the hospital room. She frowned and opened the window. A few days later, Fong Jing silently passed away. Wasn't he supposed to have a chance to wake up? Why did he die? Ling Shan grabbed the doctor's shirt. The doctor shook her head. Ling Shan stared at the cold reflection of the doctor's glasses, and it felt as if something had struck her heart, leaving a hollow space inside. At the funeral, some people offered comfort, while others expressed their regret. Ling Shan numbly received these words, her heart heavy, but no tears came from her dry eyes. In sharp contrast to her, her mother-in-law was a mess. The old woman cried in her dialect, her body going limp like she had no bones, crying so intensely that it felt as if the river would turn backward and the sun would lose its light. She claimed that her daughter-in-law was a bad omen, that she had cursed the entire family when she was young, and now, after marriage, she had cursed her son to death. She called her a blood-sucking demon, a monster in human form. While crying, her mother-in-law tried to tear at Ling Shan. Ling Shan suddenly felt overwhelmed. She couldn't understand why someone could cry so much, or how one could invent so many endless lies. She shook her dizzy head and stepped out of the morning hall to get some air by the window. A woman in black entered the morning hall. Her figure was graceful, and she gently placed a bouquet of red roses in front of Fong Jing's portrait. The woman didn't linger. She put down the flowers and hurriedly left, brushing past Ling Shan, who was standing by the window, the faint scent of perfume trailing behind her. "Please wait a moment," Ling Shan called out to her. The woman turned around, removing her sunglasses. Her face was beautiful, but her eyes were swollen from crying. "You must be Maina?" Ling Shan asked. "What's this about?" The woman replied. "It's nothing," Ling Shan said, pulling out a small red velvet box from her pocket. "I think this is something Fong Jing left for you." The woman opened the red box. Inside was a sparkling ring. The gemstone on the ring gleamed, dazzling the woman's eyes, making it hard to see the true nature of the marriage. The ring didn't only symbolize love, it also represented loyalty, but more than that, it revealed betrayal. The woman took the box, her eyes reddening again. She took a deep breath, as if waiting for her sorrow to settle. "Fong Jing promised me that after Qingming, he would divorce you," the woman said softly, looking directly into Ling Shan's eyes, her gaze filled with resentment and challenge. Ling Shan remained calm, her eyes devoid of any emotion, like a still pond. "You know about my relationship with Fong Jing, don't you? You killed him, didn't you?" The two women locked eyes in a long, prolonged silence. It was likely longer than the night Fong Jing died, maybe even longer than the night she learned of her husband's infidelity. Fong Jing was a good husband. He never mentioned a divorce. Now that he's dead, who you are doesn't matter anymore. Ling Shan spoke first, denying the woman's identity and leaving her dead husband's memory intact and clear. The woman stood with her back to the light, her face somewhat unclear. After a long pause, she smiled as if letting go of something and turned to leave. Fong Can walked out from behind Ling Shan, taking her hand, cold as ice, and then placed his hand on her shoulder, stiff as a statue. "Mom, did you know about her and Dad's affair all along?" Ling Shan turned to look at her son. Her expression softened as she gently ruffled his hair. "Yes, I first met her around the same time I met you." Ling Shan liked eating wild vegetables. She had loved them since childhood. She knew exactly which ones were bitter, which were sweet, and which were poisonous. She also knew the exact amount of poisonous herbs one could consume before they would kill you, because her father had been poisoned to death. That afternoon, her father woke up from a drunken stupor, lying on the bed and crying out that he was hungry. Grandma went out to the fields, and Ling Shan went to light the stove. Soon, she served up a plate of wild vegetable scrambled eggs. She calmly watched her father eat bite after bite, holding her tattered doll. With each bite, he grew closer to death. After her father died, Grandma went insane. She often muttered that the woman had come back to collect her debt. That woman was Ling Shan's mother, the one who had been strangled by her father and buried in the yard on a moonlit night. Ling Shan thought Grandma was truly mad. How could a dead person climb out of the earth and kill someone again? People shouldn't fear ghosts. People should fear other people. Grandma, lost in her madness, would cry night after night, crying for her dead son, crying for her dumb and silly granddaughter. Ling Shan was tortured by the crying, unable to sleep for nights on end. She didn't know how long someone had to cry before they died. On several nights, Ling Shan thought of getting up and making Grandma a plate of wild vegetable scrambled eggs. As winter passed and spring arrived, the rape flowers bloomed yellow, and people went mad. By the time the wild vegetables had grown everywhere the next year, Grandma's insanity had worsened. This old woman, not only muttering daily about a dead person buried in her yard, but also rambling about the time she had sold Ling Shan away, claiming that her mother had forced her to give up on the idea with death threats during her confinement. At that moment, as Ling Shan was about to go dig wild vegetables, she felt a chill run through her body. She gripped the hoe tightly, her mouth dry, her palms slick with sweat. She ran to the hillside, desperately digging, thinking about making Grandma a pot of wild vegetable soup for lunch. But Grandma would never drink it. She had already committed suicide, hanging herself with the very rope that had strangled her mother and hung from the beam. Ling Shan returned home and opened the door. Grandma's toes were pointed toward her chest. The wind blew in, and the rope tied to the beam creaked ominously. After Grandma's death, Ling Shan became an orphan, drifting between relatives, enduring disdain and learning the pain of living off others. She entered society at a young age and, by chance, met Fong Jing. Fong Jing treated her well. He was full of energy and warmth, bringing light to her dark childhood. Despite opposition from their families, they quickly fell in love, married, and had a child. Fong Jing liked adventure and thrills. He loved anything wild, like camping, picnics, and, of course, wild women. The first time Ling Shan met that woman was at their son's 100-day celebration. The woman was dressed eye-catchingly, almost stealing the attention away from the white, chubby baby in Ling Shan's arms. What Ling Shan didn't know was that this woman would later steal her family as well. Ling Shan found out about her husband's affair on a snowy day. The snow was so heavy it was terrifying. Fong Jing said he had an urgent work matter and left through the thick snow. That night, as he returned, Ling Shan secretly went through his phone. She felt utterly hopeless, her heart colder than the snow outside. In the end, drained of all energy, she put the phone back as it was and sat on the sofa all night, thinking through everything. Outside, the snow piled layer after layer, and she suddenly felt a sense of absurdity. As a child, her mother didn't want her, her father beat her, and her grandmother hated her. It seemed like she had never been loved. After marriage, she thought she had found a pillar to lean on, only to realize it was nothing more than an illusion. She was still the one who wasn't loved. Love was so abundant in this world, so why couldn't she have a little of it? On Qingming Festival, Perhaps the other woman had finally had enough of living in a nameless, unrecognized relationship. She wanted Fong Jing and Ling Shan to divorce.
Divorce?
Ling Shan, while her husband was asleep, secretly flipped through his phone. The word divorce made her feel a little disoriented. She recalled the conversation she had had with Fong Jing on their wedding night. "Will you ever stop loving me?
No.
Will you leave me?" "Of course not. Silly girl. I'll never leave you either. You should say this. You, alive, belong to Fong Jing. You, dead, belong to Fong Jing's ghost. Stop it. Yes, Fong Jing, alive, you're mine. Dead, you're still mine." On April 4th, Qingming Festival, some go to visit the dead, and the dead come to visit the living. The suppressed thoughts from a long winter began to sprout in the spring, growing wildly like wild vegetables in the fields. Ling Shan had already planned a plot during their Qingming outing. She knew Fong Jing loved excitement and new experiences, and he would never refuse camping or wild food. She lured him to her hometown and personally made him a deadly dish. Fresh eggs and vibrant wild vegetables, she watched her husband eat them, bite after bite. With every bite, he grew closer to death. She was well acquainted with the dosage and toxicity of these wild vegetables, and to avoid suspicion, she ate a little too. Next, she just had to wait for Fong Jing to start convulsing, foaming at the mouth, just like her father had done years ago. What she didn't expect was that the toxicity of the wild vegetables was so great. After only a few nibbles, she felt like she might die. Fortunately, she vomited some of it out, easing the stomach pain, though her head felt heavy. When she saw Fong Jing's pale face, struggling helplessly on the ground, her own suffering seemed to lessen. However, when she saw Fong Jing trying to force his hand into his throat to induce vomiting, her heart sank. He couldn't throw up. If he did, he would divorce her, and she would be alone again, a homeless orphan, abandoned once more. She couldn't bear that. She struggled to crawl over and held his hand down, but Fong Jing, as if seeing through her thoughts, pushed her away with all his strength. Ling Shan collapsed on the ground, feeling weak, her consciousness growing more and more blurred. The last thing she saw was her son Fong Can running over, while Fong Jing had already shoved his hand into his throat. After the funeral, Ling Shan slept for 3 full days, unable to wake up no matter how hard she tried. In her dreams, there were her father, her grandmother, and Fong Jing. They stood beside her bed, making an eerie sound that was neither crying nor laughing. The sound was sharp and piercing, its power so intense that it penetrated her dream and reverberated in the real world, making Ling Shan's eardrums ache. She opened her sore eyes and rubbed her aching temples. The strange sound grew even clearer, as if it were coming from the next room. It was like seeing a ghost. The warm spring sun filled the room. So how could there be a ghost? She pushed open the door to the next room and saw a crying old woman, her mother-in-law, who hadn't finished crying at the funeral and had come home to continue wailing. Grandma was holding a portrait of her son and crying uncontrollably, her voice alternating between muffled sobs and loud wails, mixed with incoherent mumbling. Ling Shan's mind buzzed, like a knife had sliced through her skull, cutting away the layers of confusion in her brain until it reached her childhood. There, she saw a girl, dumb and silly, holding a doll. When she was little, her mad grandmother had cried like this. During the day, it made people feel cold, and at night, it made people shudder with fear. She cried day and night, and Ling Shan wondered, how long did someone have to cry before they died? Grandma cried from fall to winter, and from the melting snow to the budding trees. The following year, when the wild vegetables spread across the land again, Grandma was still crying. Ling Shan didn't want to wait for Grandma to die from crying. One night, when she was again awakened by the sound of her crying, she took the hemp rope and sent Grandma on her way. Finally, she could sleep in peace. Her sleep quality had always been good, just like her father's. After strangling her mother and burying her body in the yard, he soon fell asleep. After hanging Grandma from the beam, she also quickly fell asleep. Now, Ling Shan listened to the sound of crying, which was just like Grandma's, her heart racing. Her eyes wandered to a silk scarf on the table, then to a bathrobe belt behind the door, and the data cable charging on the bedside. These long, thin strips of fabric, if you grabbed both ends, the remaining length would perfectly fit around a neck. If she slipped it over her neck, just a little pressure, her heart pounded fiercely, and an evil thought began to grow wildly in her mind. Mom. Fong Can appeared behind her, startling Ling Shan. She regained her composure, realizing the dark thought that had crossed her mind and breaking into a cold sweat. Fong Can noticed his mother's unnatural expression but didn't ask any questions. He simply helped her into the bedroom. I'll take Grandma back to the old home this afternoon. We've been so tired these past few days.
We all need some rest.
Yeah, we really need a good rest. Ling Shan slumped onto the bed, answering with lingering unease. That night, Ling Shan slept uneasily. A woman in a red dress entered her dream. The woman was graceful, her body surrounded by a pleasant fragrance. When Ling Shan saw the woman's face clearly, she suddenly woke up with a start. Her son was right, it wasn't time to rest yet. On the 7th day after Fong Jing's death, Ling Shan took Fong Can to burn paper at the graveyard. The graveyard was neat and clean, bare, without a blade of grass. A crow caught above them and flew off into the distance. In front of Fong Jing's grave, a bouquet of red roses was placed. Dew clung to the petals, indicating that the person who had placed them hadn't gone far. There was a faint smell of perfume in the air, a scent that seemed familiar. As they left the graveyard, mother and son saw a woman in a red dress driving away. With the window down, they could clearly see her face. She was wearing sunglasses, her features beautiful, and on her left ring finger was a shiny ring. The sunlight reflected off the gemstone, momentarily blinding Ling Shan. She covered her eyes and quietly wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes. The car soon disappeared around the corner. Fong Can, do you hate Mom? Ling Shan stared at the street corner, lost in thought. Fong Can looked at the rows of gravestones on the hilltop. One of them had a touch of red. Someone had placed the same bouquet of roses there for his father. No. Fong Can shook his head. Ling Shan rubbed her son's face, smiling with a sense of relief. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Did you remember the license plate number of that car? Of course, I remember it. Fong Can had always had a great memory, just like his mother. For example, the woman in the red dress today, he had only seen her once, but he could never forget her. Fong Can's first encounter with the woman wasn't at his father's funeral, but during his father's hospitalization. It was a warm afternoon, and the woman, tearfully, was holding his father's hand, gently stroking his father's cheek. Fong Can, feeling awkward, hid behind the door. The couple's affectionate gestures felt like slaps to his face, hot and stinging. The teenage boy had, for the first time, witnessed raw betrayal, and the main character was his own father. That night, his father breathed heavily and evenly on the bed, while his son, beside him, breathed rapidly, staring at the nearby machines. Beep, beep. The repetitive mechanical sound was grating. Fong Can knew his mother hated noise, and he had inherited that trait. He couldn't stand it either. Should he pull the plug? If he did, everyone could sleep peacefully. He stood up, as if guided by some strange force, and walked toward the machine's power plug, just like that day when he saw his father struggling on the floor after being poisoned. That day, he had looked at the messages on his father's phone, and then at his grandmother, desperately pressing his father's hands. Suddenly, things became clear to him. In that moment, he transitioned from a naive boy to a burdened young man. Without hesitation, he walked over, grabbed his father's hand, and pressed it to the floor. His father's phone lay nearby, the screen flashing 2 messages. One read, "When will you be back?" The other, "You promised me you'd divorce her when you came back." Fong Can remembered everything clearly. He wrote down a car license number on a piece of paper and carefully tucked it into a book. His mother had been so exhausted lately. It was time to help her carry some of the weight.